Hello, it's Aaron Wren, and welcome back to the show. Today, my guest is Nate Fischer. He is the CEO of New Founding, which is a firm that builds and backs companies defined by American ideals and a positive national vision. He joins me to discuss the new strategy document that they just released that talks about the forces that he sees reshaping America in the years to come. And there's a link to that in the show notes. Nate, thanks for joining me.
Aaron, thanks for having me.
First, you call yourself a macro investor. What does it mean to be a macro investor?
So there's a few different angles here, and I'll touch on a couple of them. One is top level. I'm looking to make investments starting with a high level macro thesis, a thesis that sort of encompasses major changes happening at the macro level, which could be the national level, it could be the global level. Often that's contrasted with someone who's a value investor or someone who's a bottoms up investor, where the decisions are principally starting at a particular asset. So often what you'll say is a value investor focuses on valuation. They look at, is this particular property underpriced? Is this particular company underpriced? Often with much less of an emphasis on the broader landscape. You're evaluating something specific. The macro person, in contrast, is saying, here's a major thesis about how I think the world is going to change, and I'm going to look for a range of opportunities within this landscape that would be bets on that thesis. So that's one way of describing it. Another a way that really resonated. There's a well-known macro investor who described how his superpower, as he described it, is the ability to envision very different configurations of the world. And you don't necessarily bet aggressively on any particular one of those, but you at least have an openness to substantial changes in how the world is configured, which again contrasts with value investors who will typically assume that things don't change that much. So a lot of times a value investor is looking to find a company that's going to look pretty much the same in 10 years and 20 years. Buffett was famous for that. I'm looking at where I think the world may change substantially and bets that can be placed in light of that.
How did your previous investment company make its investment choices based on a macro thesis?
So this was an interesting personal story. I've always been drawn to non-consensus ideas. And I would say as a child, I was drawn to very contrarian ideas, which can be the danger is you can be a little reactive. You're just looking for what everyone believes and you're taking the opposite. I think a more mature version of that is you are aware of where the consensus might be wrong, aware of where the general sentiment is improper, and looking for a change. So I graduated from law school in 2010. Really in the depths of the wake of the financial crisis, of the recession that followed the financial crisis, and particularly there was a major real estate glut and a major real estate price depression, especially in the Sunbelt states that had seen substantial growth during the mortgage boom, the real estate boom of the aughts. And in particular, I partnered with a classmate and we focused on Florida and Texas real estate. And Florida and Texas real estate, Class C, which is lower income Florida and Texas real estate, was deeply distressed. It had been in many ways, it had been one of the top boom asset classes driven by cheap debt. And it was the one that crashed the hardest. So you were seeing apartment buildings in Florida and Texas that were, I would say the entire class was seeing north of 10% vacancy, which is substantially higher than normal apartment vacancy. We were seeing apartment buildings trading at $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a unit. So a tiny fraction of replacement cost. Essentially, our thesis was, if we buy these, it doesn't matter how depressed the market, how overbuilt, how depressed the market is today. We've seen multi-decade durable trends of people moving to these states. Population has grown. There are attractive places for business. There are attractive places to live both from a jobs perspective, from a cost-effective perspective, many other lifestyle factors. And that's going to continue. And ultimately, if you're going in, you're buying properties that are really financially distressed because of high vacancy, and you just wait 3, 4, 5 years, and if you're just able to hold on to these, you're guaranteed to see more people move into the area. That vacancy is going to end up, occupancy is going to end up returning to normal levels, and those properties will converge to replacement cost. And that's really what happened. We bought about 7,000 apartments over 3.5 years, probably. It was really a wild way to start a career, build a 300-person company around that, often deeply, deeply distressed properties. And people kept moving back. It was a non-consensus theme at the time. There was a lot of fear of a double dip recession, they would call it. It wasn't guaranteed we were going to. Many people's perception was this is a sort of deep, long-term blow to those markets. They were very real estate-driven economies, and so if they faced a recession, then when are they going to recover from that? Our view was the macro fundamentals were there. There was this extraordinary, maybe once in a lifetime opportunity to buy at deep discounts, and that would quickly return to normal. And that's how it played out. The thesis proved correct. I really didn't know anything about real estate. Good example of sort of the opposite of conventional value investing. I didn't know much about real estate. I went in there. I sort of figured out as I went along. I certainly didn't have the skills to make expert real estate picks the way an experienced investor would. But I knew that I was buying with such a margin of safety, given the macro thesis, that we could afford to make some mistakes. And there were some big mistakes. I remember a $500,000 roof-related mistake in Jacksonville when we went there. But had we not gone there, we would have missed out. Had I waited 6 months, I might have missed out on millions and millions of dollars of potential profit from that. So it was really that the top-down thematic bet. The thesis proved correct. Markets returned to normal. And then in many ways, sort of beyond that thesis, I would say the Fed kind of doubled the outcome by continuing to print money. And we saw really a boom in real estate during the rest of the decade, which was more than we could have underwritten. But I think a key to any sort of investing, especially macro thematic investing, is you want to make sure you have a lot of positive optionality. It's hard to predict with absolute confidence any sort of macro move, especially the timing of it. So you want to make sure you're safe on the downside to a variety of potential scenarios. And you have a lot of ways that you can benefit, both directly based on the thesis and based on a number of different further ways that plays out.
So with new founding, it sounds like at least one of your macro theses is that the existing economic and social system in America is coming under disruptive pressure. I mean, did I read that right? And then what's causing that?
Yes. I essentially, following that previous move, I spent a number of years in the technology space, traveling around the world, studying different global dynamics, looking at trends that you were seeing in America during the Trump era and such. And it was very clear that we were seeing a rise of political conflict. It was clear that rise was wasn't just a sort of matter of small partisan differences that were sort of heightened by political actors, but actually the result of really radically different visions for the country. Many of these are themes that you've actually talked about. You really influenced a lot of the thinking on this at the deep level. But the negative world toward Christianity. We're in a world where many of the traditional, the foundational values of our civilization are no longer the values that are held by many of our nation's elites. And that's a world where you have many people who still hold those values, and you have many people who hold radically different values. In particular, most of the elites hold radically different values. And when you have a divergence like that, that is a dangerous environment for the stability of the society and the stability of institutions. It leads to it can lead to a significant loss of trust in those institutions. I think we see additional factors. So really, there's sort of three major factors I look at. I look at sort of the pillars of the global system, at which America was at the center, were globalism and this sort of rise of globalized institutions, managerialism, and the dominance of large-scale bureaucratic institutions. And again, this is not just government. This is government, corporations, academia, universities. You sort of see the same dynamics across all these spaces. And then finally, a sort of prevailing ideology of liberalism or radical liberalism or liberation that in some ways is presented as sort of the moral ethos of these institutions. And these are not independent factors. These really interlocked. Large bureaucratic organizations allowed the global scale that fit the ideology of globalism, and liberalism really complemented and to some extent even sacralized, you could say, the nature of these depersonalized managerial institutions. You have an idea of meritocracy, for instance, where it's all about sort of an equal playing field, fits with an organization that's very impersonal in how it deals with you, the way bureaucracies are. So you have this sort of ethos that has defined the American and the international order. And what I see is three major trends challenging this. So we're seeing a rise, and a lot of them are tied to the rise of the internet and the rise of digital transformation. So we're seeing a rise of global disruptions. There's more and more disruptions around the world, whether they're geopolitical, whether they're technological. You can see security breaches on the other side of the world can take down entire systems in the U.S. You can see how dependence of supply chains means that you're exposed to pandemic in China, for instance. You can see how Houthis are able to shut down shipping in the Red Sea with $2,000 drones. Real disruptions that in a global system can have knock-on effects far from halfway around the world. I think the most recent one is you saw the Japanese raised interest rates 25 basis points. Feels like a very small increase in interest rates. And that sent major volatility through global financial markets over the last few days as essentially these high leverage trades where people would borrow money in Japan and use it to buy technology stocks in the US had to be unwound, and that can cause massive volatility in the US. So you see in an interconnected world, a situation where if everything's very stable and sort of trending in the same direction, that can provide positive leverage. But as you see growing disruptions, they can reverberate around the world in a way that really undermines particularly globalized institutions. Another one is you see growing bureaucratic stagnation. You see this sort of situation where I think a lot of policies are catching up with bureaucracies. They're becoming less effective. I think the Secret Service is obviously showing signs of incompetence with the Trump assassination attempt. Boeing is a great poster child of this. And in many ways, it's exposed as technology helps make clear that you can have much leaner organizations. There's actually alternatives out there that as Twitter laid off, as Musk laid off 80% of the people at Twitter, and it functioned roughly the same. You're starting to see that maybe these bureaucratic organizational models are much less competitive than people thought. SpaceX is doing things that Boeing and NASA are utterly failing to do. So it's undermining the perceived credibility of the dominant institutional model. Finally, the third one is political and cultural alienation. And I touched on this earlier, but as they embrace more and more radical forms of liberalism or liberation, sort of extreme Pride Month promotion of BLM, promotion of DEI, that's just alienating large numbers of people who are traditionally longstanding constituents of these institutions. So these three trends are growing, and I think they show no signs of stopping. And I think together they will not just alienate people from these institutions, but they'll actually undermine the stability of many of the dominant institutional models, the stability and the relative competitiveness of them. And that leads to a situation where this entire order is perceived as illegitimate in a sense. If they're not as effective, then their claims to authority are challenged, and less competitive, vulnerable to challenges. So, in a sense, it opens a landscape to the question of what comes next. You no longer have to rely on. I think there was a longstanding perception that you don't like what's happening. You may not like what's happening in these institutions, but that's the only game in town. So if you want to influence the world, if you want to rise in your career, you have to go to Goldman Sachs. You have to go to McKinsey. You have to rise in these organizations because they're the ones that are shaping the world for better or worse. In a world where that's not taken for granted, that opens up entirely new paths to influence, and potentially much, much higher leverage ones.
Social media comes to mind as a phenomenon, maybe in common with some of these, not all of these things, but especially the cultural alienation, maybe some of the disruption. There's a lot of talk about social media in the Arab Spring, for example. Has technology been an accelerant or a cause of this? Or is technology kind of a separate thing that's been going on? Because we constantly hear about technology and disruption and AI and all of that stuff.
So I think the Arab Spring is an interesting example. Absolutely, you can compare two similar examples and see how their perception was different. The Arab Spring. So think of Facebook's, and another theme I'll put here is effectively the digital domain is in many ways a layer of government. Who governs these platforms is actually setting policy that has some of the most profound implications on really what the nature of governance in the digital age looks like. They're powerful layers of government. And Facebook's early mission was to make the world a more open and connected place. Going to my theme about the politicization of the world, that is not a politically neutral mission statement. A politically neutral, I don't know if there's anything that's truly politically neutral, but traditionally companies would have mission statements like make and sell more widgets. Microsoft had a computer on every desk. Yes, there's political implications of it, but it's not a central point of the mission. When you get to Facebook saying our goal is to make the world a more open and connected place, that is clearly profoundly political in its implications. And that's a mission that fits very closely with globalism and with liberalism. The openness is seen as a value of liberalism. The connectedness is the making the world more connected is very much a value of globalism. And so you saw the Arab Spring as an example of disruption, but it was widely seen as disruption that fit within that system. It was celebrated, it was heralded as these digital platforms are helping usher in yet another level of global liberalism. They proved a little less, I think, efficacious than many assumed, but at the very least, the disruptions were seen as disrupting illiberal regimes. What's striking is the exact same dynamics that enabled the Arab Spring, enabled the rise of ideologies that proved to be much less friendly to that global order. So you saw this with Brexit, and then you really saw this with Trump's election, where Trump's election was largely driven by energy that arose on social media outside of the control of established gatekeepers, the mainstream media. And it turned out, to the shock, really to the absolute shock and horror of many in Silicon Valley, that their algorithms were not guaranteed to result in a more open and liberal world as they saw it. But on the contrary, they actually allowed the rapid rise in organization of people who were very dissatisfied with the direction of that order. So I think what the technology, what the social media platforms do is they allow people to come together. They allow movements to arise that harness a lot of energy, harness a lot of dissatisfaction that originally seemed to be dissatisfaction with illiberalism, moving in the direction of liberalism or democracy, I guess. I don't really like the word liberalism as much, but very quickly actually allowed a lot of discontents with that order to rise. And I think that actually set the stage for a lot of the darker changes we saw in Silicon Valley in coming years as in many ways, the wokes there realized that technology is not neutral. These algorithms are not neutral. Something that gives you more of what you want may be purportedly neutral from a political perspective, but it turns out that it may advance certain ends that would be contrary to what was sort of assumed in this materialistic ideology. And so they really began campaigns to impose their value system on the digital domain to promote things like algorithmic safety would be one of the terms, prevent extreme views, essentially impose algorithms that would actually steer people in the direction that they wanted, that conform to their values, rather than in directions that might challenge those values.
Where do you see this going? And I ask it in this respect. There's a huge divide in the sort of Twitter landscape between people that think our system is very brittle and may collapse or suffer some other severe disruption, and those who think that the system is very strong and very robust and that things are going to basically be run the way they've been run. I have tended to be skeptical of the idea that our system is going to collapse. I think our system looks relatively stable in important ways. As you say, there's a lot of disruption. Where do you come down on that? How do you see these forces evolving?
So I would certainly err toward there's a lot of fragility in the system, and I would say there's fragility. Now that's different than predicting an imminent collapse. I think it's perilous to predict imminent collapse. These are complex systems. They're complex systems laden with leverage. So I would look at that. I would say that is a fragile system. That's very different than a system that you can predict is going to collapse at any given moment. You could have looked at the mortgage market in 2004, 2005 and said, this is a fragile financial system laden with leverage. But if you put on a big short against the mortgage market, then you probably went bankrupt. And a lot of people did. A lot of people actually recognized it. They shorted it, but they were 3 years too early. And it is expensive to go against the system at the wrong time. So I think just because I see fragility, it's important not to be overconfident about any prediction of collapse. But why do I see it as fragile? I see it as fragile because I believe that the trends I described go to the heart of the legitimacy of the current system, go to the heart of the stability of the system. These are not models that can be easily adapted, I believe, to many of these trends. So I think you're seeing a world where there's going to be sort of systemic structural change is going to happen, is going to need to happen. And I don't think the current system can manage that. Now, there's obviously different degrees of how sort of volatile or violent the change is. It's hard to predict that, but I don't see the current system and really the current incumbent class. I guess what I would associate with that is the dominant class in many ways is the professional managerial class. A class of people whose legitimacy comes from the fact that they have the credentials valued in a bureaucratic system and a managerial system. An MBA is seen as sort of a legitimating mark that you have the virtues and skills to run a business. You have a public health degree, right? That is supposed to show that you are an authority who should be listened to on matters of public health. And I think we've seen both the recognition that those credentials mean a lot less than people might have assumed. In many ways, the financial crisis of 2008 was extremely discrediting to the entire MBA class. In many ways, the COVID response, particularly the sort of obvious ideological corruption of it, when they told you to stay home, but they blessed BLM marches because racism was a public health crisis, as they said. was extremely discrediting to the public health class. So we see this world where the credential, where the entire sort of leading class is credentialed because of their role in these bureaucratic institutions and by bureaucratic institutions. And I don't see those as the dominant skills that are going to lead in the digital age. I think that you're going to see a return to a world where skin in the game is one of the only things that people look at. In a world where you're inundated with information, you're inundated with very smart sounding arguments in many cases. You're inundated by images of people making the images designed to be persuasive. You're going to learn to distrust all of that. Your default reaction to anything you see in any form on the internet is going to be assuming this is fake, assuming this is gamed, assuming this might well be a bot, and you're just not going to trust it. And what are you going to trust? You're going to trust proven displays of skin in the game. I think one of those is courage. I think another of those is people who have clearly put their money where their mouth is in other ways. You could actually extend this to Bitcoin and the idea of proof of work, where there's skin in the game behind the money. But that's a very different model than expertise. So in many ways, that's the model that was replaced by the bureaucratic system. In a bureaucratic system, the sort of credibility to lead comes from a credential that's conferred on you, and the sort of checks on your behavior come from the bureaucratic system, essentially checking bad behavior and ensuring that you're sort of following an established expert guidance. In a skin in the game system, you have legitimacy to run an organization because you have some skin in the game, because you're the owner of a business, because you've taken a risk that aligns with the actions you're taking. It's a very different organization of society. I think it's more what you see in Silicon Valley. It's certainly more what you see with private business ownership. The political version of it, I think, will be interesting to develop out. Arguably, aristocrats, people who had some sort of long-term tie to something, had a degree of skin in the game that is missing, certainly from people who are administrators in a bureaucratic governance system. So what that evolution looks like is hard to say, but it's a very different class with a very different set of values that is likely to emerge in the digital age. And I'll add sort of one high-level way of looking at this is other times we've had major technological paradigm shifts, you've seen a major shift in the order. So when you had the printing press, that involved a transition from a feudal system to a nation state system, which was a radically disruptive change in the world order that was heavily driven by the dominant medium of communication. When you had the telephone, the telegraph, the television and radio over about 100-year period, you saw a radical evolution in the nature of the governing class, the nature of the world order. You had a couple of world wars in that period. I think our baseline assumption when you have a change as radical as the internet and as radical as what that does in terms of eliminating centralized gatekeepers and allowing mass communication, really allowing the sort of rapid contagion of ideas that you saw with the Arab Spring and with the Trump election, is our baseline assumption should be the political and institutional order after that change will look radically different than the one before that. And again, that doesn't say a lot about what the transition looks like, what the evolution looks like, but that it's going to be significantly different, I think should not be surprising and should be our expectation.
When you use terms like fragility and skin in the game, it makes me think of Nassim Taleb, who wrote about these concepts a lot. Has he been an influence on your thinking in this?
It was a very strong influence. What's interesting is I had a lot of instincts, I would say, from how I grew up. I grew up homeschooled, very sort of non-traditional upbringing, homeschooled back in New York before it was, I would say before it was cool, actually at a level where we would have a telephone number of a lawyer on our fridge in case the cops showed up to arrest us for truancy, which never happened to us, but was not uncommon for early homeschoolers. So grew up in an environment where it was very non-traditional. Went to Harvard Law School, very conventional environment, but was naturally skeptical of a lot of that. You could say the sort of expert doctrines, and then starting the business. It was striking how what I experienced building that real estate business was a very different way of operating than the sort of model on paper that you would learn at Harvard Business School, where I took a few classes. So I sort of instinctively was drawn toward recognizing that the world behaved differently than we were taught. And it was at that point that I read Taleb. I read Anti-Fragile. I read Skin in the Game. And it immediately resonated. It was sort of very clear that he was describing a critique that resonated with my own instinctive critique. So I would say long before, it's actually interesting, I'm very involved in politics now. I was really not very interested in politics at the time. I saw politics as a very sort of, as a place where Mitt Romney type careerists would sort of climb their way to the top, and there was really nothing interesting happening. But long before I got interested in politics, I was sort of red-pilled in the business world. I had a very different approach to how to think about business and how to think about risk in business, driven by Taleb and driven by a few other people who complemented that, but probably shaped the positive vision. And what was interesting is then when I came into politics and sort of started reading some of the people on the new right, the people who were challenging the established way of thinking in politics, it immediately resonated again, because it was just an application of those same principles to the political domain.
So with New Founding, your new company, first, I guess it's been around a little bit now and it's gone through some changes. So it'd be good to talk about like what New Founding is for people who don't know it. And then how are you making investment decisions in light of this environment you just described?
So high level, in a sense, I started New Founding as a business, as a venture-oriented business, as a bet on this macro thesis. And the macro thesis was essentially the world is becoming deeply politically divided. Technology is going to be a driver of that change, and the digital domain is going to be a significant up for grabs domain for all sorts of questions, including political questions, to be resolved. And finally, the for-profit space, the entrepreneurial space, offered a way both to pursue aspects of this outside of the confines of established institutions. So it was an outside or disruptive bet from the very beginning. The bet was we should build disruptive things outside of established institutions, and that was sort of secondly, that was a good vehicle for promulgating a positive vision. Finally, my sense was people are deeply hungry for a positive vision. The American right has largely been defined by a conservatism that was limited to saying no, that was limited to essentially trying to just slow down the progress of the left without really putting out an alternative vision for society and largely accepting the left's vision implicitly. And my view is people are deeply hungry for an alternative. They want a positive. We should be fighting for our vision of where we as a society should be going, not simply saying no and trying to slow down what the left is doing. So that was the fundamental macro thesis for New Founding. And really, I knew it would be a process of figuring out what it looked like. We started with a strong media play, and a big part of the media was, if we put out the positive vision, if we put out some of these ideas, people will be drawn to them. There's thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people even who are disillusioned with where things are going. They're not public about it, particularly in 2021 when we started. It was an environment where people deeply worried about sharing dissident views of any sort, especially people who are in elite professional organizations. And yet there's many, many, many people looking for alternatives. And if we're public about it, we'll be sending a scarce signal. We'll be flying a flag that will actually draw people to us. That proved accurate. We ended up having just more and more people come to us, including many of incidentally, I found you that way, right?
Yeah.
I reached out to you when you were still running a anonymous. I think you were still pseudonymous with the Masculinist, but the ideas resonated, and so I reached you and I got to know you, and we ended up doing a number of things together. That similarly mirrored the thesis of how New Founding would grow. Is we would put out these messages, people would come to us, and then we would broker connections that never could have happened, where values alignment was a significant component of it. Was an important point in that being a valuable connection, and we would build businesses around that. And we ended up doing a number of things in media before really moving beyond media as the primary business, and actually sold our media entities while continuing to grow this network. And then in the last year, little bit over a year, we launched some of our core initiatives. We have a talent network where we build a network of people and start placing them with aligned organizations. We actually just placed someone with a very prominent, very exciting right aligned media organization in an engineering role. And then we launched our venture fund and our real estate fund. And then I would say American Reformer, which we co-founded with you, was in this same vein. It was a nonprofit, but it was a nonprofit that was focused on many of the same themes, particularly in the Protestant church. So I see it as fundamentally about bringing people together to found organizations that are shaped by this vision and that are pursuing things in this vision, some of which have been nonprofit, others of which have been for-profit, all of which are trying to move the ball in the same direction and bring together the same sorts of people. So I'm assuming most people are fairly familiar with American Reformer, but on the business side, we have a venture fund where we invest in businesses where there's a right aligned thesis to the business itself, or something about the business that is advancing a right aligned outcome. So what you'll see traditionally there were affinity based venture funds, or funds that would invest in Christian founders, or maybe funds that would invest in liberal founders or conservative founders, right? There would be ones where it would be based on the identity of the founder, but often it was sort of, you're indifferent about what the company is doing. It's generally doing, it might be making widgets. Ours is different. Ours is really, do we have a different thesis about the world? Based on our understanding of the world, is there an opportunity we see where we believe there's an opportunity for outsized returns with a business that, if it succeeds, will actually advance a world that we want to see? And that can really look at, I would say there's two sort of primary themes there. One is it a business that is serving a niche that is being underserved by mainstream alternatives? So we invested in a pro-life health insurance startup. That's a space where it's actually meaningfully different. If you don't want your health insurance premiums to fund abortion, then it's not just the same policy with different marketing, but it's actually a policy that's going to comply with your conscience versus not comply with your conscience. It goes beyond that, actually, in the sense that it'll actually have a different doctor network. If you have a doctor network where the pediatrician will take your kid behind closed doors and potentially encourage transgender confusion, report them to authorities, that is a dangerous, that is something that is a profound risk in a mainstream health insurance policy. If we develop a network of aligned doctors who are not going to do that, that's not just a different set of marketing. It doesn't just feel good for you to move to that insurance policy. That's actually a materially different product for you that matters deeply in terms of your ability to protect your way of life and protect your family. And on top of that, the founders of this, couple of Catholic guys, had deep experience in the insurance and healthcare space, and really developed a very innovative policy. They're launching it in Texas this year, a very innovative policy that costs only a little bit more than some of those Christian health sharing plans, and yet has all the benefits of insurance. So they actually found you could call it a sort of loophole in Obamacare, where they're allowed to issue policies that together replicate health insurance, but aren't subject to all the Obamacare regulations. And one of them came from a company that was a startup that grew and sold for $1 billion that had a very similar policy. So really cutting edge entrepreneurial expertise applied to a problem and vision that aligned with our movement. Another one that would fit this idea is is a company called Armanet, which is an ad network in the firearms space. So anything firearms related is blacklisted by Google and by the mainstream, by the leading ad platforms. If you have a gun blog, it's hard to monetize. If you have a gun company, it's hard to reach customers who want your product. If you're a Republican office holder, it's hard for you to even target people who care about guns with your digital marketing efforts. These guys, very talented Silicon Valley founders, actually have a top venture capitalist who personally invested alongside us. They built a top tier ad platform that's filling this hole and essentially immediately grabbing the lead place in a very large hole in the market. So those are two things where it's serving things that are gaps in the market. They're essentially important services, important infrastructure for us to be able to maintain our way of life, for us to be able to build viable companies for our community. I think the other side of that is potential disruptive alternatives, where we're actually building something that we expect can become a broad category leader. And we just have a different thesis about the world. I think the key difference, and I think COVID really made this clear. Well, I'd say COVID made this clear, but it actually comes out of another example is the masculinity. A lot of the masculinity space, which you've engaged, was built on people who recognized important realities about the world that were denied by mainstream discourse. So these were not people who simply had a different set of values. They didn't just tell you should go live your life this way. They're telling you to live your life that way. No, they were people who told you realities about the world that were suppressed or not widely understood that would actually have practical implications. And I think that's a key element that we're looking for, is where do we actually believe something is true that has profoundly important business implications that other people, mainstream venture capitalists, mainstream Silicon Valley founders might miss. If we're right about that and we make a concentrated bet on what we believe, there may be the opportunity for a category winner there, not just something that's sort of a niche parallel thing. It could be something that's immediately disruptive. And that goes to sort of Thiel's famous question of, what is one thing that you believe to be true that very few people, what is an important truth that very few people agree with you on? If you believe something is important and has important business implications and few people agree with you on it, there should be the opportunity for a disruptive, for a potentially out-competitive business that results from that. So we're always looking for those. And it's sort of harder to say in advance what exactly those are, but we invested, for instance, in an AI company that has a very aligned team that has a very different approach to AI, which is a space where your beliefs about the person and your beliefs about the nature of intelligence matters deeply. We invested in a micro school startup where essentially there's a different thesis about the best way to create schools and scale schools and deliver education versus the sort of, you could call it a very large bureaucratized school model. In many ways, our entire public school apparatus is arguably designed to sort of optimize the production of people to fit into a managerial bureaucratic economy. And here's a model similar to homeschooling that is focused on micro schools and a very different way of delivering education and educational services. So there are startups where there's a different thesis about what is going to work. And if we're right, those companies may be the category winners in their space. So that's the venture side. I'll add the real estate side is a values aligned community. So you can think of it as sort of an aligned charter community is a term that's popularly used, but we're actually buying a large share of a town, large share of property around a town and in a town, a few hours east of Nashville, and orchestrating the move of dozens of people, multiple businesses. There's going to be a new factory there. We're all looking for a distinct way of life. In many ways, I think, again, conservative, the right has been overly libertarian. There's a very leave me alone ethos. There's a very consumeristic ethos. We're looking for a different approach. We're looking for a question of how can we actually innovate on how you live together in a community? What is our distinct alternative vision for what a thriving, successful town should look like? And I would argue our positions matter more. Conservative values should matter more the more concentrated people are together. So in many ways, if you're sort of living on your homestead, spread out a long ways away from other people, conservatism matters a little bit, but it doesn't matter that much. Whereas if you're getting a lot of people together in a town and you're trying to develop rules for the town, norms for the town, institutions for the town, what function does the public library provide? What types of civic institutions and rituals do you have? Our values matter a lot when you're trying to figure out how to live together. The essence of politics, in many ways, as Aristotle described it, centers on these questions of how do we live together and live well. And we see this as really as an entrepreneurial landscape in some sense, where there's a sufficient concentration of people who share values that we can do things that you're not able to do if you're sort of atomized citizens scattered throughout suburbs or cities where most people don't share your values. So this is a fund. We're buying land. We're selling land. We're essentially doing a classic land development play. But fundamentally, it's a community where we hope to demonstrate a better vision for life that can then be a model that we can use as we think about communities across the country.
Yeah, that's the Highland Rim project, I think it's called. And I did a podcast with Josh Abatoy on that was well received. So you can look up that podcast. Maybe I'll go back and drop a link to that in the show notes to this one as well. You know, just this week, I saw an article in the New York Times about a guy up in Minnesota, I think it is, who wants to create a Muslim subdivision. And then you'll also read different articles about people trying to create like an apartment building that's supposed to be for like LGBT retirees. It does seem that, quite apart from conservatives, this idea of the old big sort where, you know, people are moving to counties that are more politically like them is kind of morphing to more just entirely affinity group based migration and living and wanting to be around people who share, you know, more fundamental elements.
Absolutely. And I think that's natural. That is, politics works when you live around people who have a shared vision of life. If you don't have a shared vision of life, at best you're sort of in an economic zone together. You have your house, you have your apartment or whatever. You're engaging in commercial activity, but there's real limits to what any sort of community can achieve. Whereas if you live in an area where there's shared aspirations and there's shared values, you have the ability to do a much richer array of things together. And that's a timeless, find your tribe and build. That is a timeless endeavor. I think in many ways we had shared norms in much of America. Now, America started as a federalist country. There were very different ways of life in different parts of America. And that was something that the original model preserved. Now, I would say economic factors, among others, helped end that and really push something that was a much more integrated national system, certainly political as well in the Civil War and the post-war model. And as long as there was sort of a shared national culture, as long as there was enough of a shared national culture, that may have worked. But when you're in a world where there's radically different visions of life, that no longer works. That leaves many people. That either leaves people in every community fighting bitterly, almost existentially, over the direction of institutions. If you and a bunch of people in your community have incompatible visions of how children should be raised, then every policy question at the school becomes an all or nothing fight. It's not a productive way to live. And so sorting so that you live around people who have enough in common that you can focus on building together is, I think it's critical for just basic political and civic engagement. And it's something that people are increasingly aware of the extent of these differences, and they're increasingly hungry for the opportunity that provides. And I think what's interesting is you use the Muslim example. What's interesting is, again, I think Christianity to many people was reduced. And I would argue this was sort of a conscious co-option of Christianity by liberalism to some extent, was largely reduced to sort of very individualistic, personal piety and practices. That's not what Christianity historically was, and it's certainly not what Islam is, as an example. Islam very, very clearly is a set of practices and a way of life and an approach to governance. It's arguably as much a political system as it is a religious system, that it cannot be fully practiced unless done in common with others. So it's very natural that they would want to come together and build a community that can be organized around their principles. Now, I think that's there's a lot of questions over the extent to which that can happen in the U.S., but it's a natural outgrowth of what they believe and what they practice. I would argue that a richer and fuller understanding of Christianity, likewise, is going to be much more public and much less purely private and individual. And we likewise should want to see communities that reflect those norms.
The last question I have is, you use the phrase exit to disrupt in the document that caught my eyes. What is exit to disrupt?
So I think there's really, so we're in some sense exiting mainstream institutions, moving to states where we're aligned with people. There's a lot of leaving associated with that. And I think you had a piece that was really a profoundly convicting piece where you said Christians should be on the advance, not the retreat, and how the American model has often been one of simple retreat, especially for conservatives. I mean, in some sense, our entire country was people who came here and left. But conservatives have a long history of leaving institutions. And in many ways, it's just leave the institution, abandon the institution, and build often a sort of permanently inferior alternative, one with less institutional capital, less heritage, less resources. And then that one starts to get liberal, and you leave that one and go on to yet another sort of splinter group. In response to the problems, the cultural and political alienation, there's been a lot of proposals. And I think it's easy to continue that pattern and continue to leave with the goal of sort of building our own little enclave and hoping that this stuff passes by. You have solutions like the Benedict option, which I think arguably fits into that. Rod Dreher's proposal that really shaped a lot of thinking in the mid 2010s. I think you made a very compelling argument that is the wrong mindset for Christians. We should not default to running away and building our own inferior parallel institutions. At the same time, I think often exiting and leaving institutions done tactically and with the right strategy can be the most effective way of changing direction of the system. So what I want to emphasize is there's the sort of exit to build your sort of permanently inferior parallel models. And then there's really the Silicon Valley approach, which is let's say you're dissatisfied with how things are going let's say you're working at Microsoft and you're dissatisfied with how things are going at Microsoft. You leave Microsoft and you build a startup where your goal is to do things the way you believe they should be done, with the ultimate goal of disrupting them, claiming that category. And there's numerous cases. I believe Home Depot was founded by people who were at another hardware store, and they were executives there, and they were dissatisfied with what was being done there. And I think they actually challenged it and got fired, and they left. And what did? They started a company that ended up just growing way beyond that and arguably disrupting that. And that's sort of a famous case. And I think as much as anything else, it often comes down to the mentality of what you're doing. Like, are you doing it as a form of retreat to just try to sort of let things pass by and settle? Or are you doing it with the mentality of, we know where we want to get, and our aspiration is to win. Our aspiration is to lead. Our aspiration is to be as successful or more successful than we would be if we ran this institution. But we believe the best way to do it is through building externally and either taking back the institution later or displacing that institution as the leading institution. My focus is on the latter. I'm not really interested in the past things, but I think sometimes going back to the sort of fragility of the system and this would be the best defense of even the Benedict option model, sometimes it means retreating to a point where you can preserve things that you know will be very valuable in a post-disruption scenario, and you're designing them to be resilient to a lot of the disruption you see coming. So either you're building something that will at least survive and allow you to then step up and take a leadership role in the future, or you're building something to immediately try to sort of go for the crown and win. But what you're not doing is you're not just retreating simply to let the world pass by and hope to sort of settle for something that you know is never going to be as good. So again, it's think of it as exit to disrupt. Think of it as tactically exit with the goal of winning. And I think one last point I'll make that's an important one is it's often just a matter of enjoyment. It's not a retreat. It's if you're going to be building, if you're going to be devoting hours and hours of a very large share of your waking life to an endeavor, there's something to be said for doing that in an organization or in a structure that you enjoy. For a lot of men, for a lot of young men in particular, bureaucratic organizations are just fundamentally hostile to their values. They're fundamentally unpleasant places to be. It may make sense to spend a few years there. If you can get into an elite organization, there's often a tremendous amount you'll learn in a few years, but it can be a deeply unpleasant, dissatisfying place to build a career. Whereas if you're building a startup outside of that, it's just a lot more fun. You'll be putting in a similar number of hours. You may even have a similar expected financial outcome, but you'll be doing so in a culture where you're around the sort of people you enjoy working with. And I think that willingness to recognize that we need to have fun. We need to do this in approaches that we enjoy. When you have a plausible belief that that's actually the best path to change, I think that's the key. Sometimes you put your head down and you do things that you don't enjoy because they need to be done. But in a world where we recognize that many of these incumbent systems are going to be disrupted, the best move may be to exit them and build something that is designed to really optimize for the successor organization. I think you're actually going back to your point about Christians should be on the advance. There's many, many cases where, especially in Christian organizations, those are the ones that we should fight to hang on to. Those are the ones that actually remain. Christian colleges, for instance, many of those would be the natural bastions that if we can fight to keep them, they can be massive reserves of institutional capital. They can be tremendously valuable. And I actually wrote a white paper on this, talking about sort of a path for Christian colleges through a disruption. I think will actually take down a large share of our higher ed system. But I think Christian colleges have some advantages. If we fight to preserve those, to keep those, rather than retreating and running away from them, those are capturable institutions. There's other institutions where you can look and you can say, that institution's a sinking ship. The best thing to do is to leave a sinking ship as quickly as possible and to build something that's going to be poised to replace it. So it needs to be a case-by-case decision. It's not like we should have a default stance of the whole world's going to blow up and we should just leave and go build our own thing. But if you have a well-developed thesis about why certain types of organizations are likely to decline or even sink, then exiting and building what you believe is a better digital age replacement for them is often going to be a lot more fun and ultimately more impactful.
Well, again, my guest today has been Nate Fischer. He's the CEO of New Founding. You can see a link to them and the strategy we've been talking about in the show notes. Nate, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.